What if the greatest threat to Napoleon wasn't a battlefield, but a balance sheet? Imagine the world's most feared general, his armies undefeated, his legend growing with every campaign, brought to his knees not by cannon fire, but by an economic war of his own making. This is the story of how Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of Europe, tried to conquer the world with ledgers and laws, and how that very strategy sowed the seeds of his own downfall. It's 1806. Paris is electric with victory. Napoleon stands at the absolute height of his power, crowned emperor, his influence stretching from Madrid to Moscow. He has redrawn the map of Europe, installing his family and marshals on foreign thrones. His armies seem invincible. But across the narrow English Channel, one nation remains defiant: Great Britain. Its navy is unbroken, its global empire is expanding, and its merchants are growing fantastically rich on international trade. Napoleon, a military genius, is deeply frustrated. He had dreamed of invading Britain, but his fleet was shattered at the Battle of Trafalgar. He can defeat any army on land, but he can't touch the island nation protected by the Royal Navy. So, unable to win with ships and soldiers, he decides to fight a different kind of war. On November 21, 1806, from the conquered city of Berlin, Napoleon signs a revolutionary document, the Berlin Decree. This is the birth of the Continental System, a total, continent-wide economic blockade of the British Isles. Picture the scene. In every city under French control, from Hamburg to Rome, officials nail proclamations to city gates. All trade with Britain is now illegal. Any ship coming from a British port is to be seized. Any British goods found on European soil are to be confiscated. In the candlelit taverns and bustling coffee houses, merchants whisper in hushed tones. Their entire world has just been turned upside down. Smugglers, meanwhile, see an opportunity of a lifetime, plotting new routes through the fog and darkness. Napoleon's ministers crunch the numbers. The goal is simple but audacious: starve Britain of trade, cripple its industries, create mass unemployment, and force it to sue for peace. They believed that Britain, a nation of shopkeepers, as they scornfully called it, would collapse without its European markets. The financial stakes are immense. We're talking about hundreds of millions of francs, the modern equivalent of well over $100 billion, being wagered on this grand economic experiment. But this blockade is more than just a line on a map. It's a gamble with the fate of an empire. As French customs agents begin to patrol the thousands of miles of European coastline, and as black markets bloom in the shadowy corners of every port, the true cost of this economic war begins to mount. Inflation starts to rise. Shortages of colonial goods like sugar, coffee, and cotton spread across the continent. And in the very heart of France and its allied nations, the seeds of popular unrest are being sown. To understand why Napoleon took this monumental risk, we need to step back and look at the man himself. Step into Paris at the turn of the 19th century. The city pulses with a mixture of ambition and anxiety. Napoleon Bonaparte, once a minor Corsican noble, an outsider, now strides through marble halls. First as first consul, and then as the self-crowned emperor of the French. He doesn't just dream of military glory, he dreams of a completely French-dominated Europe. A Europe where Paris, not London, is the center of finance, culture, and power. A Europe where Paris sets the price of gold and grain. Imagine the crowded Parisian markets of the era. The scent of fresh bread mingles with the ever-present tension of war. Merchants whisper nervously about the price of British goods, sugar, coffee, spices, textiles, that are becoming harder and harder to get. Smuggled items, once cheap commodities, are now luxuries. In the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon's advisors gather in smoky war councils, poring over maps and ledgers, desperately searching for a way to break Britain's economic spine. The Treaty of Amiens in 1802 had brought a brief, fragile peace. But it was really just an illusion, a pause to catch their breath. By 1805, after the thunderous victory at the Battle of Austerlitz, where he crushed the combined armies of Russia and Austria, Napoleon's military dominance on the continent was absolute. His Grande Armée was the most feared fighting force in the world. Yet the problem remained. The British Navy still ruled the seas, blockading French ports and flooding Europe with its manufactured goods and colonial products. Frustrated, Napoleon turns to an old economic theory, mercantilism. This was the belief that national power is built on controlling trade, maximizing exports, and hoarding gold and silver. He envisions a self-sufficient Europe, a fortress economy completely closed to British commerce and united under his imperial authority. The Continental System was mercantilism on a scale never before imagined. It was total economic warfare. How did this Corsican outsider, this man of war, become so obsessed with economics? Why did he genuinely believe he could starve the world's greatest maritime power into surrender? The answer lies in his belief that he could control everything, that he could bend the will of nations and the laws of economics to his grand design. And so the real war begins, not with muskets and cannons, but with customs declarations and decrees. In 1806, the Berlin Decree is just the first shot. Every port from the North Sea to the Mediterranean is ordered closed. French customs agents, the douanes, swarm the docks. They tear open crates, they search ships' holds. They are hunting for any trace of contraband tea, textiles, or tools. Then, in 1807, the Milan Decree follows, tightening the noose even further. Now, any ship, regardless of its flag, that had traded with Britain or even submitted to a British naval inspection was considered an enemy vessel and would be seized. Napoleon's vision was one of total economic isolation, a continent united in commercial war against a single island. Picture the vast coastlines of Europe. Patrol boats slice through the fog-shrouded waters. Smugglers, in small, fast boats, slip ashore under the cover of moonlight, their secret cargoes of sugar and coffee hidden in barrels of wine or sacks of grain. In port cities like Amsterdam and Lisbon, merchants who had built fortunes on trade with Britain now face ruin. Riots break out as livelihoods vanish overnight. Suddenly, British goods become more valuable than gold. Black markets bloom in every back alley, in every coastal town. But a system this vast is almost impossible to enforce. The blockade was a sieve, not a wall. Contraband poured in through 1,000 different holes. It came through Spain and Portugal. It was smuggled through Russia. It found its way in through the Baltic states. Bribery became commonplace. A French official could be paid to look the other way. British traders became masters of deception, inventing new routes, creating false documents, and outsmarting Napoleon's patrols at every turn. The numbers tell a staggering story. French customs revenue, which Napoleon expected to be bolstered by seizing British goods, actually plummeted. The cost of enforcing the blockade, of paying for the thousands of agents and patrol ships, soared, draining the imperial treasury. British exports to Europe certainly dropped, but they never disappeared. British merchants simply found new markets in North and South America and Asia. The blockade was hurting Europe far more than it was hurting Britain. What happens when you tell an entire continent to stop trading? You create a world of smugglers, black marketeers, and resentful citizens. Napoleon's grand design, his economic superweapon, was being undermined not by armies, but by ordinary people who just wanted a cup of coffee with sugar in it. The economic costs were mounting, the political resentments were festering, and cracks were starting to show in the foundations of his empire. This was a war he couldn't win. History remembers Waterloo, the final charge, the cannons, the defeat. But what if I told you Napoleon's empire didn't fall on a battlefield? What if it crumbled from within, eaten away by a war fought not with soldiers, but with spreadsheets and shipping manifests? This is the story of the Continental System, Napoleon's grand economic gamble to bring the mighty British Empire to its knees without firing a single shot. It was a plan that backfired so spectacularly it bankrupted his own empire, sparked continent-wide rebellion, and ultimately led him to the frozen wastelands of Russia. Imagine this. It's the early 1800s. Napoleon Bonaparte is the master of Europe. His Grande Armée is seemingly invincible, having crushed Austria, Prussia, and Russia on the battlefield. From Spain to Poland, his word is law. But one stubborn island nation defies him, Great Britain. Protected by the world's most powerful navy, Britain is untouchable. Napoleon can't invade. So he decides to strangle it. In 1806, he issues the Berlin Decree, creating the Continental System. The plan is simple, audacious, and utterly ruthless. No nation under French control is allowed to trade with Britain. Every port in Europe, from Lisbon to St. Petersburg, will be slammed shut to British ships and British goods. The goal? To cripple Britain's economy, which relied on exporting manufactured goods and importing raw materials from the continent. Napoleon called Britain a nation of shopkeepers. He believed that by cutting off their customers, their factories would fall silent, their banks would collapse, and they would be forced to sue for peace. It was the largest-scale economic embargo the world had ever seen. On paper, it was a stroke of genius. In reality, it was the beginning of the end. The first signs of trouble appeared not in London, but in Paris itself. The longer the blockade dragged on, the more Napoleon's own empire began to bleed. Enforcing this continent-wide ban was a logistical nightmare. Picture French customs officials raiding warehouses by torchlight in the dead of night, only to find empty crates and cleverly hidden secret tunnels leading to the sea. The system was leaky from day one. Smuggling exploded, becoming a billion-franc industry. Along the rugged coastlines of Europe, smugglers became folk heroes. Daring figures who slipped British goods, coffee, sugar, textiles, and even weapons past customs patrols. These weren't just small-time crooks. This was organized crime on an international scale, often with the tacit approval of local officials who were either bribed or simply looked the other way. The economic fallout was devastating for the continent. Industries in places like Holland and Germany, which had relied on trade with Britain for decades, were ruined. Port cities that had thrived on maritime commerce, like Hamburg and Marseille, saw their wharves fall silent. In Marseille, riots broke out as food prices soared and merchants went bankrupt. People who once made a decent living were now facing starvation. The irony was brutal. The system designed to punish Britain was inflicting far more pain on Napoleon's own subjects and allies, and his allies were not happy. Napoleon had installed his family and friends as rulers across Europe, his brother Joseph in Spain, Louis in Holland. But even they couldn't ignore the suffering of their people. They began to cheat the system. Spain, Holland, even Napoleon's supposed ally, Russia, started making secret deals with the British, quietly opening their ports to forbidden trade. The economic pressure was simply too great. King Louis of Holland famously declared, "I must govern for the good of my people," and openly defied his brother's orders, allowing Dutch merchants to trade with the enemy. Napoleon was furious. He saw it as a personal betrayal, but it was a simple matter of survival for these nations. Meanwhile, back in France, the government's finances were spiraling out of control. The cost of enforcing the blockade, with its vast army of customs agents and patrols, was immense. Add to that, the cost of Napoleon's endless wars, especially the brutal guerrilla war in Spain, and the French treasury was being drained dry. Inflation skyrocketed. The government printed more and more money, making the currency worthless. The French budget deficit exploded. The very economic stability Napoleon promised was evaporating. And what about the British? Were they starving as Napoleon had planned? Not exactly. While the blockade did cause economic hardship, Britain adapted with remarkable resilience. Their powerful navy launched a counter-blockade, seizing any ships trading with France. British blockade runners, operating swift and daring vessels, became masters of the sea, darting through the English Channel and the North Sea, delivering goods to willing buyers on the continent. More importantly, Britain looked elsewhere for new markets. They expanded their trade with North and South America, with their colonies in India, and with the rest of the world. While Europe suffered, British industry found new customers and new sources of raw materials. The nation of shopkeepers proved to be far more resourceful than Napoleon had ever imagined. By 1810, the cracks in the Continental System were impossible to ignore. The entire project was unraveling. The black market had effectively become the real economy in many parts of Europe. Corruption was rampant among French officials sent to enforce the blockade. The final decisive blow came from the east. Russia, under Tsar Alexander I, had been a reluctant partner in the system from the start. The Russian economy, which depended on exporting grain and timber to Britain, was in ruins. The nobility was furious, and the Tsar was under immense pressure. In 1810, he made a fateful decision. Russia officially withdrew from the Continental System and reopened trade with Britain. For Napoleon, This was an act of defiance he could not tolerate. It was a direct challenge to his authority, a sign that his grand economic weapon had failed. His response was to assemble the largest European army ever seen, the Grande Armée of over 600,000 men, and march on. The myth is that Napoleon was defeated by British muskets and Prussian cannons at Waterloo. The reality is that his empire was hollowed out from within, bankrupted by its own economic policies long before that final battle. He was a genius on the battlefield, but in the world of trade and finance, the rules were different. He failed to understand that economies are not like armies. You can't just command them to obey. They are complex, interconnected systems, and trying to bend them to your will often produces disastrous, unintended consequences. Now, let's fast forward to today. Does any of this sound familiar? The logic behind Napoleon's blockade, isolate your enemy, starve them of resources and force them to surrender, is the same logic that drives modern economic sanctions. Think about the sanctions placed on Russia, Iran, or North Korea. The goal is to inflict enough economic pain to change a country's behavior without resorting to military force. But the results are often eerily similar to what happened 200 years ago. Black markets thrive. Ordinary civilians suffer the most from shortages and inflation. Targeted regimes often find ways to adapt, finding new trading partners or developing smuggling networks. And these sanctions can have unintended consequences, sometimes hurting the economies of the countries imposing them or their allies. The story of the Continental System is more than just a dusty chapter in a history book. It's a powerful warning about the true price of economic warfare. It shows that empires can be brought to their knees not by armies, but by the slow, invisible grind of inflation, shortages, and lost trust. The weapons have changed, of course. Today, we fight with financial algorithms instead of armies, and with sanctions instead of sieges. But the fundamental risks remain the same. Economic war is seductive. It promises a clean victory without the bloodshed of a traditional war. But the collateral damage is real and can be devastating. So, was Waterloo really the end of Napoleon's story? Or was it just the final bloody symptom of a disease that had been rotting his empire from the inside out for years? The next time you hear about a new trade war or a new round of sanctions, remember the ghost of the Continental System. Will today's leaders learn from the past, or are they doomed to repeat the same costly mistakes? The answers are all there, hidden in history, if you just know where to look. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about how money and power have shaped our world, make sure to subscribe for more cinematic financial history. Next time, we'll dive into the story of the empire that nearly bankrupted Great Britain. You won't want to miss it.